Viewers, this man transferred his deceased wife's thinking into another robot to bring her back to life. But after the robot was ready, he had to find out what terrifying incidents happened to the man with that robot. At the beginning of the story, we are shown a very great scientist named George. George was very intelligent, and recently, he had received an offer from a very big company to create the best robot ever. George accepted the offer and now had a full 3 years to complete his project. The company had set up a very large laboratory for his research, which was situated deep in the forest so that George could conduct his research without any interference. As usual, George would go jogging in the morning and then head into his laboratory. He aimed to create a lifelike brain. The brain would function like that of a teenager, meaning it could use 40% of its capacity. However, it seemed that George was not satisfied with these 2 experiments. He wanted to create even more advanced robots. Without much thought, George continued working on his experiments. He often talked to his wife, Julia, over video calls. Due to his contract, George could not talk to Julia very often, which made her a bit upset. Then George received a call from his manager, who was overseeing all his projects. But George's manager was not happy with his experiments because the company had higher expectations for even more advanced robots. So far, George had only delivered a robot named Jivan to the company. George's manager was angry with him because he had been given almost 3 years. Out of the given time, 2.5 years had already passed. Now, his manager threatened George that if he did not deliver a good robot within the next 6 months, he would lose his job permanently. From this, we learn that George had not informed the company about a major project, G2, meaning he was working on his personal project alongside the company's project. George then went to another laboratory where he was working on a 3rd robot named G3. This robot was far more advanced than the other 2 robots. However, George had not informed the company about this robot either. The thinking powers of this robot were just like humans, and once completed, it would be able to think and make decisions like a human. George even tried to make this robot look somewhat like his wife, Julia. The next day, a car stopped in front of George's house, with a doctor and some of his assistants inside. Here, a crucial part of the story is revealed. George's wife, Julia, had died a few years ago. However, Dr. Mary's company had developed technology that could store a person's consciousness. That large black box George was talking to contained Julia's consciousness. But George had not been able to communicate with Julia properly for a few days, which is why Dr. Mary and her assistants came to examine the black machine. After examining it for a while, they did not find any issues with the device but realized that someone had tampered with Julia's consciousness. They all immediately suspected George. If George did this, it would be against their policy and completely illegal. Because of all these things, George could also lose his job. However, Dr. Mary trusts George and leaves without saying anything. George was genuinely worried at that moment. But now, we learn that George had stolen Julia's consciousness from the machine. He had copied his wife's consciousness and embedded it into the 3 robots so they could think like humans. George's plan was to transfer 100% of his wife's consciousness into J3, creating another robot like his wife, Julia. As George continued to develop J3, it started affecting Jivan and G2. Although Jivan's mind was like a child's, it did not react much to J3. But G2, having a teenage-like mind, became very jealous of J3. George was investing most of his time in completing J3, which G2 did not approve of. One day, when George was asleep, he had a vision where he was driving a car with his wife. This was the time when George had received the contract from the company. He was very happy about it, but when he told Julia that he would have to stay away for nearly 3 years due to the contract, she was not pleased. They initially argued about the contract, and soon, the argument escalated into a serious fight. Suddenly, their car met with an accident, and Julia died in that accident. Since then, George decided to accept the contract and create a robot where he could transfer his wife's entire consciousness. George wakes up to the sound of his alarm. As soon as George went to his laboratory, he was terrified because he was supposed to be alone in the entire lab. He checked different sections to see if anyone was there. Suddenly, G3 lunged at George, grabbing him and attempting to harm him. G3 was angry about something, and George began questioning G2 to understand why. It turned out that Jivan had secretly informed G3 about George's plan to transfer his deceased wife's entire consciousness into G3's body. Jivan didn't want to become obsolete and end up as scrap, which made her very angry with George. George tried to reassure Jivan that this wouldn't happen, and eventually, she was convinced. However, George was extremely troubled by Jivan's actions, so he temporarily deactivated her. Months later, some people from the company were coming to check George's progress. Without wasting time, George continued working on G3. He had completed all the internal systems and only had the outer parts left. George used some parts from Jivan to make G3 more advanced. After a lot of hard work, he fully completed G3, only needing to transfer his wife's consciousness into it. After ensuring everything was in order, George reactivated Jivan. But Jivan's behavior began to change. Whenever she saw George with G3, she couldn't control her emotions. The situation worsened until Jivan, unable to handle her emotions, fell into a depression and drowned herself in a nearby river. When George learned about all this, he was utterly shocked. If the company found out about G2, not only would George lose his job, but he could also face jail time due to all the illegal activities. Now, George had one last chance with G3, into which he urgently needed to transfer his wife's consciousness. As George continued working on this, G3 began to sense that something was wrong. She realized that she had her own life, and once George's wife's consciousness was transferred into her, her own feelings would be completely replaced by those of George's wife. Just then, George's manager saw G3, which George had not informed the company about. All this information got leaked to the larger company, and even Dr. Merrick filed a petition against George, declaring him a criminal. George's manager demanded that he shut down the entire project as soon as possible, as it was putting the company at risk. Now, George had no way out. Soon, large helicopters, used for national security, arrived outside George's laboratory. George was extremely scared, so he opened a nearby briefcase which contained a gun. But before George could get the gun, G3 quickly grabbed it and pointed it at him. She told George that she did not want his wife's consciousness in her body. George then explained to G3 how much he loved his deceased wife and how bringing her consciousness back to life was his dream. After hearing George's heartfelt words, G3 melted and agreed to the experiment. Without wasting any time, George transferred his wife's consciousness into G3. Within moments, G3 was fully activated, now with the consciousness of George's wife inside her. So, the AI robot is no longer G3 but George's wife, Julia. However, Julia was a bit confused and looked at George differently. At that moment, a call came in on the faulty black box. George immediately picked up the call, and on the other end, it was Julia's voice telling him that this was her last call, and she wouldn't be able to call him again. George was baffled, unable to understand how he was receiving a call from his wife despite the machine being completely broken. Then, George heard the voice of Julia's daughter, which made him wonder how all this was possible. Julia was dead, so how could their child have been born? At this point, the dark reality of the story is revealed. A few years ago, it wasn't Julia who died in the accident but George. Everything that seemed to be happening with George was actually taking place within the black box, with Julia observing from the real world. Julia was alive in the real world, and it was George's consciousness inside the black machine. Julia used to communicate with George's consciousness this way. To keep a person's consciousness alive, they are given a purpose. Therefore, Dr. Mary's company had implanted the idea in George's consciousness that he needed to bring his deceased wife's consciousness back to life. Consequently, George conducted all these experiments within his consciousness and transferred his wife's consciousness into a robot. With this, George's mission was fully completed and his timeline expired. This meant that Julia would never be able to communicate with George again. And with this, our story ends here.